From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist here at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes channels. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, K-L-U-G-E, to view other lectures delivered by current and past Kluge scholars, including several by past ACLS Burkhardt Fellows. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, as well as PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the study of humanity, and which we will award in 2015, which is this year. For more information about the Kluge Center, please visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, and I invite you to sign up for our RSS email list on the way out to learn about future programs and opportunities to conduct your own research here at the Library of Congress. Today's lecture is titled Family Matters, Testing Paternity in the 20th Century. Our speaker is Nara Milanich, now an ACLS Burkhardt Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center. Nara's research examines the social and cultural history of the paternity test. On the surface, this may appear to be an inquiry into do-it-yourself DNA paternity kits or child support disputes that play out on daytime television. But in fact, it turns out to be an intricate history that touches on matters of family law, children's rights, the U.S. judicial system, societal interests reconciled with self-interest, financial hardships, science, genetics, evolving technologies, even questions of what constitutes motherhood and fatherhood. To weave this together is an ambitious project, one that Nara is currently using the Library of Collections for, as she traces the reception of paternity science in law and social practice, and delineates how its consequences differed for men, women, and children across national contexts. Her talk today will offer a glimpse into these insights. Nara holds the American Council of Learned Society's Frederick Burkhardt Residential Fellowship for recently tenured scholars. This prestigious fellowship supports long-term, unusually ambitious projects in the humanities and related social sciences that will result in a major scholarly work. It allows recently tenured scholars to conduct research at any of the 13 participating residential research centers, of which the library's Kluge Center is one. The fellowship encourages more adventurous, wide-ranging, and longer-term patterns of research, which are often interdisciplinary and fall outside the boundaries of a particular specialty. The Kluge Center is grateful to the American Council of Learned Societies for this continued collaboration, and it is our distinct pleasure to welcome representatives from ACLS here with us today. Nara Milanich is an associate professor of history at Barnard College. She joined the faculty of Barnard in 2004. Her scholarly interests include modern Latin America, Chile, and the comparative histories of childhood, and gender, and law and social inequality. She teaches courses such as Inequalities, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Latin American History and Society, Women and Gender in Latin American History, and the survey course, Modern Latin American History. And she writes and publishes in both Spanish and English. She's currently working on a book project titled Family Matters, Testing Paternity in the 20th Century, which is the subject of her research here at the Kluge Center. And her first book, Children of Fate, Childhood, Class, and the State of Chile, 1850 to 1930, was published by Duke University Press in 2009. So please join me in welcoming Nara Milanich.
I want to begin by thanking you all for being here today. It is now time, I guess at least after this talk, to proceed to your nearest Irish bar. So I appreciate that you have come and spent the afternoon with me. I also want to thank the various individuals at the Kluge Center. Jason mentioned, I think he used the word vibrant to describe the Kluge Center. I would also use the additional adjectives hospitable and cushy. It has been a wonderful year so far, and I'm pleased to say it hasn't ended yet. I also want to thank the representatives from the ACLS who are here with us today. It is a great and wonderful gift to be able to spend a year far away from one's beloved undergraduate students in a little carol reading. So it's been a really terrific year, and the good thing about doing a lecture in March rather than in May is that I still have some time left. So I want to begin with a picture of a truck, which you may or may not be familiar with here in Washington, D.C., but I assume it is coming to a street near you. In the past couple of years, residents of New York and Boston have been greeted by this unusual spectacle, the Who's Your Daddy truck, which is a mobile facility that trolls neighborhoods offering DNA tests on the spot. Splashed across the truck's side, this provocative query elicits double takes and snickers, as you might imagine, and also lots of texts to me when my friends see it. I always get a photograph sent to me. I have yet to see it myself, though, I have to say. But it asks a question of long-standing cultural, legal, political, and scientific interest. As sources from the Bible to modern-day sociobiology have observed, whereas a mother's identity can be known by the empirical fact of birth, fatherhood has always been maddeningly uncertain. How do we know who is your daddy, after all, and who has a stake in this question in the first place? Paternal uncertainty is a very old trope indeed. It recurs in medicine and law, in literature and science, and in social and political theory of the most diverse stripes. The problem of proving paternity has animated doctors at least since Hippocrates and preoccupied jurists of Roman, Islamic, and Jewish law. Doubting fathers populate the Bible, Homer, Shakespeare, Balzac, Goethe, Hardy, Strindberg, Machado de Assis, and Guy de Maupassant. The classic theories of 19th century theorists and armchair anthropologists like Friedrich Engels, Backhofen, Morgan, as well as Freud and the ethnographer Malinowski in the 20th century, all posit uncertain paternity as a primordial foundation of human society and the human psyche. More recently, some sociobiologists and feminists, very strange bedfellows indeed, have suggested that patriarchy derives from men's inability, their fundamental inability to know their offspring. And then, of course, there's Maury Povich. I don't have much to say about Maury Povich's theory of uncertain paternity, but I felt that I needed to mention him at some point in this talk, so I just have, and perhaps he will come up again in the Q&A. Enter the Who's Your Daddy truck. Today, of course, a strand of hair, a cheek swab, can determine biological parentage with a certainty exceeding 99.9% For many observers, modern biomedicine has thus laid to rest this transcendental human and societal quandary. But has it? Has it really? I'm writing a book that narrates the social, cultural, and political history of paternity testing in the 20th century, and it traces the emergence of the paternity test as a feature of law, public policy, and popular culture, and explores how biological constructions of parentage have shaped modern personhood and modern citizenship. I'm going to explain throughout the course of this talk what in the world that actually means. What assumptions about kinship and descent and identity undergirded this quest for a paternity test? What new understandings of family and sexuality did a science of paternity make possible? How did testing impact gender relations? How did it shape children's rights? How did paternity testing police the boundaries not just of family, but also of race and nation? The answers to these questions depend on where we look. Different states and different societies have evinced markedly different attitudes towards parentage testing. And so a transversal question that really runs throughout my book and my research is, how were these new forms of knowledge received in diverse global contexts? How did the paternity test's meanings and uses differ cross-culturally? The test purports to give incontrovertible truths based on universal laws of biology, and yet the ways it has been received and the meanings that have been assigned to it have varied very markedly across societies and over time. So what was the paternity test actually good for? What was it used for in concrete terms as it emerged? Well, it was initially heralded as a tool for identifying the fathers of illegitimate children, and for ferreting out those adulterous progeny birthed by unfaithful wives. It was used in inheritance disputes in which wealthy men died and putative heirs popped up, as one Argentine commentator put it once, like mushrooms, seeking claims on the estate of the deceased. It was used to identify babies accidentally swapped at birth in hospitals. Certainly cases like this were very rare, but they generated an inordinate amount of public attention, and in so doing, I think, telescoped ideas about descent and identity and nature and nurture. But the test soon moved out or beyond family law and filiation disputes and cases of mistaken identity. It became a routine instrument of social or state welfare policies. And by the 1950s, it had been incorporated into immigration proceedings, becoming a litmus test not just of kinship, but also of citizenship or nationality. What becomes clear from all of these scenarios is that the question, who's your daddy, matters to private individuals and families for reasons that are both patrimonial and existential. What belongs to me? What do I have a right to? And who am I, right? But it also matters to states and societies. Beginning in the 20th century, family ties in many polities have conferred access to Social Security, welfare, pensions. Children bereft of such ties have historically become, of course, public charges on the purse of the parish or the local community, the municipality, the state, or what have you. Meanwhile, of course, kinship often confers nationality or the right to migrate. In other words, kinship is often considered a pre-modern form of association, but in fact it helps structure modern social and economic citizenship. If kinship structures citizenship, then kinship testing, it seems to me, potentially impacts all of these realms. So this is the broad rationale for my study, and I don't put it necessarily in those terms, but if somebody says to me, why are you writing Maury Povich history, that prelude or prologue is sort of what I would maybe put in other terms, explain to them. But let's get a little bit more concrete here. What are we talking about when we talk about a scientific paternity test? What does that look like in the decades before DNA? Well, my story really begins in the 1920s, when new knowledge about human heredity generated the first quite rudimentary but self-styled scientific tests of parentage. The 1920s is, of course, a high-water mark of hereditarian thinking in the world. This is the moment when eugenics is all the rage in the United States, when the metastasis of racial hygiene is spreading throughout Central Europe. And this is out of this medium comes not just eugenics and racial hygiene or race science, but also the paternity test, the most rudimentary, at least, forms of paternity testing. The possibility that a scientific test might be able to unequivocally link parent and child generated tremendous interest in scientific circles, but also in legal circles as well as popular ones. And here we might just look at, as one among many, many, many examples, an article that appeared in various US newspapers in 1921 called How the Blood Tests Made a Love Test. This article mused, deep down in those minute eddies of the human blood, nature has placed the hallmark of every man's heredity. In his blood cells is bound up the unmistakable record of his fatherhood. So there's this kind of breathless rhetoric about the capacity to uncover this secret, this unmistakable record that nature has placed somewhere on the body. And so what emerges is not necessarily one test, but rather a collection of various quite eclectic methods, all of which are based on the novel premise that the locus of paternity, and identity, more generally, may be found somewhere on the body. That is to say, the bodies of progenitor and progeny carry unequivocal physical clues that reveal the relationship between them, perhaps in the eddies of the blood, perhaps somewhere else. So scientists wrote, beginning in the 1920s, researched, wrote about, and performed paternity tests, and courts began accepting this form of evidence across Central and Southern Europe, especially in Germany and Austria, but also Italy, for example, in Scandinavia, in Russia, in various countries of Latin America, especially Brazil, Argentina, and Cuba, in the United States, in Egypt, in Japan, and probably other places that I have not yet found, but I still have a few months left in my carrel up there. In essence, their research involves a systematic reconnaissance of the body in search of somatic markers of descent. And I think it's worth briefly accompanying them on their trip around the human body, mostly because it makes for some fabulous visual images. So I'm going to take advantage of the PowerPoint. So what are we talking about? What sorts of tests are we talking about? Well, dentists, for example, one very well-known dentist in Brazil, explores how dental morphology and patterning of the palate could reveal a kin relation between a progenitor and his offspring. So here's various unfortunately the image is terrible, but there are tooth molds, mouth molds, which this dentist took of a family of 3 generations and studied the various anomalies he found in their dental structure and palatal ridges, which is to say the bumps on the roof of your mouth. So you didn't know you were going to learn anatomy here today. And he explored these characteristics as evidence of a kin relation. Another, perhaps equally odd test. Fingerprint experts studied the lines of the fingers and the hands in search of a way to read their hereditary content. Obviously, fingerprinting was especially associated with individual identification, and every individual has a unique fingerprint, but it was believed, and in fact is probably the case, that there are certain hereditary characteristics of fingerprinting, or fingerprints, and so scientists thought if we can just find the key, the Rosetta Stone of these hieroglyphics on our hands, we may be able to unlock the secret of paternity. And so much ink was spilled in various parts of the world studying. Can you imagine studying fingerprints for years on end and looking at parents and children and multiple generations of fingerprints, trying to figure out what those connections were and whether they could be used in some way to predict paternity or read paternity. Meanwhile, scientists take, moving from the mouth and the fingers, scientists take old notions of family resemblance. I mean, the notion of family resemblance is as old as humanity, the idea that for some reason children may resemble their parents or grandparents or other family members. This is a common conventional wisdom, but they ask how that conventional wisdom can be placed at the service of paternity investigation. And so the face becomes particularly ripe for analysis with all of its very strange and characteristic peculiarities. And so paternity scientists search for resemblance in traits or in family likeness. Here's just one example of what that looks like in a concrete paternity test. This from a medical legal institute in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which was actually the first place in the Western Hemisphere to begin doing paternity tests. And so in this, this test involves a whole series of, or this examination involves a whole series of tests, one of which is taking pictures of the mother, the child, and the putative father, and studying the resemblances and traits of the face in search of some clue about the relationship between them. If these photographs look strangely like police mugshots, that is not by chance. Paternity science, it was very unoriginal, I would say. It tended to recycle methods and conventions, fingerprinting, anthropometry, the mugshot, originally used for other purposes like forensic identification or anthropological analyses of race. Paternity scientists like to, for example, measure skulls. And so this particular photographic convention is clearly lifted from criminal identification procedures. But the idea here is to make subjective appraisals of resemblance more scientific by developing objective biometric measures of human likeness. I have to say that this particular image, also from Brazil, when I first saw it, reminded me mostly of Monty Python cartoons. with the head splitting open. So the idea here is to begin to measure, as you can see on some of the faces, you can't see particularly well, it's maybe too small, but to measure certain dimensions of the face in an effort to give resemblance a more scientific method of reading it. Scientists studied ear shape, noses, lips. They measured things. They looked at eye color and skin color and hair texture, and wrote about and studied their possible applications in paternity investigation. Now, if some of these methods sound suspicious, they probably should. The idea of studying teeth or measuring faces may seem futile or even crackpot to us today, and indeed it actually did even to many scientists at the time. And so scientists are debating which of these methods are actually valid and legitimate ways to read paternity. In my project, I'm really not interested in distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate science. Which scientists really could serve to detect biological paternity is not so much my focus. What I'm interested in is how people at the time understand these tests. The popular reception that the tests receive, which may have very little to do with their what we would consider to be their scientific legitimacy. And I'm interested in their practical application. In a sense, these tests, one could argue, don't uncover paternity. In a sense, they produce paternity, a particular understanding of paternity. And even methods that do not enjoy a scientific consensus are still sometimes used in courts and receive plenty of popular attention. So that seems important to me. So this project is really not about finding the real origins of paternity testing or the correct paternity test. It's really about the social and cultural meanings and contexts and legal meanings and contexts of those tests. Now, in addition to analyzing physical morphology and somatic traits, a second approach that paternity testers used sought a biochemical marker in those eddies of blood. So lots of attention, especially in the 1920s, to blood testing, to finding a marker in the blood, a biochemical marker in the blood of paternity. If this sounds somehow more legitimate than testing teeth or faces, I apologize, but in fact there are many fishy tests, blood tests going on at this time. There are tests that purport to detect vibrations of blood corpuscles. There are attempts to measure blood crystals. So there are all kinds of, in retrospect, wacky, but at the time, perfectly legitimate investigations going on about paternity or descent or identity in the blood. Ultimately, though, the most promising blood test, and certainly the one that has been most systematically incorporated into actual practice, is that based on the heritability of blood groups or blood types. Blood groups, indeed, would become the basis of modern, well, some historians of science would say, became the basis of modern genetics. So beginning in the 20th century, scientists discovered the 4 human blood groups. They realized that they are passed from parent to child according to certain immutable laws of Mendelian heredity. And this allows for the development of at least simple tests based on possible and impossible combinations of parents and children. This slide is not particularly helpful except for you got tired of looking at the ear. So these are the materials that one would have used in testing blood, which was actually a very simple process or simple procedure that could be done with quite rudimentary tools. So if a child, we all have some notion from high school biology about human blood groups. If a child is type, say, O, and the mother is, say, type B, then the father cannot possibly be Mr. X because he is type AB, and that's incompatible, right? So blood groups are very good at excluding impossible fathers, and so they provide at least rudimentary test. What they can't do, of course, is positively identify the father. They can only say, Mr. Y is of a compatible type B, say, but then so is every other man in the world who has a type B blood. So can limit, can exclude some people, but can't positively identify a father. But over the course of decades, scientists discover additional serological properties beyond the ABO blood groups, the Rh factor, MN, SP, Q. There's a whole alphabet soup list of antigens that they discover. And as knowledge of new blood properties accumulates, blood testing becomes increasingly precise and useful in narrowing down that universe of possible fathers. But it always operates, or continues to operate, based on this exclusionary logic, a fact which we're going to see shortly is very socially significant. It can only ever exclude, it can never positively identify. Then, to sort of take very quickly in one sentence, the history of this up to the present, in the 1970s, other blood typing methods, which are much more powerful, come into play, and finally all of this culminates in the early 1980s with the discovery of so-called DNA fingerprinting, right, and the discovery of perfect certainty. So one way to tell the history of the paternity test is as a narrative of spectacular scientific discovery, right? In this story, extraordinary advances in medical science have succeeded in resolving the problem of paternal uncertainty that has characterized our species ever since it was a species, basically. There are problems with that narrative. I'm sure you can tell by the somewhat facetious way I'm telling it that I don't necessarily buy it. One problem is that long before DNA, long before blood tests or facial measurements or blood crystals or any of this stuff, there were other methods of establishing descent. In fact, the trope of uncertainty notwithstanding, societies have always had social and legal methods for assigning paternity. And it's like, oh, well, of course. I mean, it wasn't like people didn't know who their fathers were before 1983 when DNA testing came around, right? So there have always been social and legal rules for understanding or determining paternity. The most common of those, perhaps, was marriage. In many global legal traditions, ancient and modern, secular and religious, including Roman law and all of its modern progeny in Anglo-American and continental civil law, in Jewish law and Islamic law, in all of these different legal traditions, marriage created the presumption of paternity, the automatic presumption of paternity. That means that, quite simply, the husband is always the father of a married woman's child or children. Marriage not only makes paternal identity certain, it really makes it automatic in this legal construction. Now, in the absence of marriage, the father's identity is not automatically known, but it is not for this reason necessarily unknowable. Depending on social and cultural and historical and legal context, extramarital paternity might be established through a whole series of different social cues, such as local hearsay, what the priest says, what the servant saw, or what the neighbor testifies. It might be established through social acts of recognition, paying the midwife, buying the baby booties, hugging the mother. Cohabitation with the mother of a child, also a very obvious kind of social cue about paternity. In other words, paternity was not just a biological relationship, but a social one and a legal one. And physical evidence might not have been available, but it might not also have been the most relevant sort of evidence to prove paternity in a construction in which paternity is a social and legal relationship. So when paternity testing comes along, scientific biological paternity testing, it challenges not the great timeless mystery of paternity, that we never knew what that was before. What it challenges are older social and legal constructions of paternity. And this leads me to one of the working hypotheses of this project, which is that scientific paternity testing doesn't solve old puzzles. It creates new ones. Biological testing has complicated, not solved, how we stake claims to belonging in the family and in the nation. So my research is still ongoing, but I want to draw some tentative conclusions from what I've said so far and what my research has shown me so far. First, the development of the paternity test is not a straightforward and unidirectional story about the biologization of kinship, in which new scientific constructions of paternity inexorably displace these older, less authentic, less certain social and legal ones. In fact, scientific constructions of paternity gain traction very fitfully, and law continues to be as important as the laboratory in determining who is a father. And here's where a cross-cultural comparison becomes very interesting. Some countries, such as Germany or Austria or Scandinavia, embrace paternity testing enthusiastically and immediately. Within a few years in Germany, for example, thousands of tests, blood tests, and then also these kind of anthropomorphic tests are being performed in German courts. But other countries, Italy, the United States and England, certain countries in Latin America, are very slow and very suspicious about these technologies. Again, not necessarily because the science isn't credible, but because the science challenges very firm and powerful constructions, pre-existing constructions of paternity. So the structure of law, I think, partially explains those patterns of uptake and rejection. So law matters immensely to this story, although there isn't some sort of easy pattern in which I can draw, in which countries with legal system X like paternity testing, and countries with civil law don't like it. It's definitely not that easy. Unfortunately, it would be nice if it were, but it's not. But law is certainly part of this story. One might say that rather than asserting a single biological fatherhood, the paternity test, what it really does is make visible the existence of multiple paternities: moral paternity, legal paternity, social paternity, biological paternity. Instead of displacing those older alternative social constructions, paternity testing really throws into sharp relief the latent tensions and contradictions between those different paternities. And this is potentially destabilizing. In fact, I'd argue that rather than according certainty, in a sense what paternity testing does is precisely the opposite. It makes uncertain that which was once settled. And I think the best example here is marital paternity. Once upon a time, as we know, in diverse legal traditions, marital paternity was a bedrock legal principle. Paternity tests make it possible, however, to demonstrate that the husband is not the father. And thereby these tests can challenge the bedrock principle that marriage creates paternity. So here's an example of where paternity testing makes uncertain that which was once inviolate. A recurring question frames my research, and I think is obvious, latently obvious in what I've said so far. And that question is, whose interests are served by this new technology and by the particular constructions of paternity and kinship that make it possible? Is it men ultimately that benefit, or women? Is it children versus parents? Is this a question less of gender than of generation? Is it families that benefit at the expense of society or the state, or vice versa? The answer to that complicated question is a very annoying one, and it depends. It depends on when we're looking at and where we're looking at. That's perhaps, I suppose, not surprising. Many scientists imagined that the scientific paternity test would shift the balance of gender power, that it would vindicate wronged women and innocent children, and it would put those deadbeat dads on the hook once and for all. So it would sort of level the gender playing field. And the trope of uncertain paternity had led many societies in the 19th century to prohibit paternity investigation outside of marriage altogether. So if you were born outside of marriage, you had no right to paternal support. Indeed, you had no right to know who your father was or establish the identity of your father in court. And this is, in some societies, perhaps not a big deal because there aren't that many people who are born outside of marriage. In places like Latin America, which is my area of specialization, illegitimacy, quote unquote, was extraordinarily endemic. And so we're talking about societies in which a quarter or a third and later a half or 2/3 of individuals are born outside of legally recognized marriage. So it's, in essence, by prohibiting paternity investigation, you're saying that most children have no right to paternal support or to know even who their father is. So these are very consequential laws that most people believe are detrimental to children's rights and welfare, as well as the rights and welfare of their mothers. So some predict that if paternity was biologically knowable, well then there'd be no reason not to allow paternity investigation. So paternity investigation will surely be legalized to the benefit of women and children everywhere as a result of these wonderful new tests. This is the prediction, but the actual impact of paternity science proved much more ambiguous. Actually, for most of its history, the biological paternity test permitted not paternity determination, but as I mentioned in my discussion about blood groups, it allowed only paternity exclusion. Once again, blood types are the most common and commonly used form of testing, and they can only ever exclude. So where does that leave us? Well, exclusion really serves the interests of those seeking to disavow paternity, right, to prove they're not the father, or he's not the father. And while paternity disputes hinged on all kinds of scenarios, usually the disavowers are men. That will only change much later. And so one could argue that, at least in its early history, paternity testing serves the interests of men who would seek to, or people who would seek to disavow paternity. Another argument that is sort of shaping my research as I begin to write this book. The history of paternity is obviously a story about gender and sexuality and kinship and children's rights, but it is equally a story about race and citizenship. Perhaps what has most surprised me in my research this year, in that little carrel upstairs so far, is the extent to which race is a constant referent in all discussions everywhere about paternity testing. It is a referent, both subtle and explicit, and this is something I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate and what this means. So this surprised me, but maybe it shouldn't have. I mean, after all, as I've just said, paternity science emerged out of this hereditarian moment that was steeped in racial and eugenic thinking. So maybe it's obvious. Any talk of heredity obviously has to, in some way, reference race. Certainly, family and race share certain cultural, cross-cultural idioms of blood and heredity and reproduction. Again, maybe it's not surprising that in talking about family, people automatically talk about race. Many early blood tests seek to and purport to establish not just parentage, but simultaneously some essential racial identity. Race is often treated as nature's paternity test in the sources that I'm looking at. Some legal jurisdictions, for example, reject tests based on physical resemblance. They say they're too fishy and subjective, but they always make an exception in cases where the races of the parents are different, or considered to be different, or when the child is considered to be a different race from its mother, however race is defined in the particular social and legal and cultural environment that we're looking at. So, for example, the scenario of a mother of one race, usually white, who gives birth to a child whose phenotype reveals its mixed ancestry, is a constant trope in discussions of paternity testing. This is true in South Africa and Cuba and the United States, places where I might expect it, but it's also true in places like Italy, homogeneous, so I thought, Italy, where people are speaking a similar language and constantly invoking this trope of mixed race relations. In fact, we saw a version of this trope just the other day in a front page story of the New York Times, which you may have seen, about the baby swapping case in France, in which a woman discovered that the tawny-skinned, curly-haired child that she had raised was not her biological child. It had been switched in the hospital and was the child of parents that in the article were identified as, quote, Creoles from Réunion Island, French colony in the Indian Ocean. Here is yet another version of this mixed race trope. And in fact, as I read the article about France in the New York Times the other day, I thought, I've read this story 20 times before, except it happened in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, here's one version of that story. Here's a version from Cuba in 1929 in which two women, again, crappy image, I apologize, Senora Perez and Senora Vega both give birth to children in a Cuban hospital in 1929. Senora Perez is identified as dark-skinned, I can't remember the word they use in Spanish, and Senora Vega is white. They go home, they look at their children. As they get older, the children increasingly don't look like themselves. Both husbands are incensed, tell me who the father of this child is, because it sure isn't me. But luckily, science comes to the rescue. A blood test reveals that, in fact, Senora Perez and her husband cannot be the parents of the child that she took home from the hospital, and vice versa. The swap is revealed. The children are switched. Great photo opportunity. They take pictures of the families switching their children back, so they go to the right racial family, and everyone lives happily ever after. Germany institutionalizes the use of blood and morphology tests in cases of disputed paternity in the 1920s, and a decade later, these exact same techniques, performed by the same scientists in these same institutes, would be put to a very different but still related use, namely racial ancestry testing. So these were proceedings in which Jews sought to challenge their racial ancestry in order to gain a more favorable racial classification under the National Socialist laws. And so, in essence, they tried to show that they were either only half Jewish, not fully Jewish, or actually fully Aryan. I have a reputation as Jewish, but in fact, the person who is recognized as my father isn't really my biological father. It's this Aryan guy over here, so actually I'm not Jewish at all. So in practice, this meant challenging what racial ancestry testing meant, or what these proceedings involved, was challenging the paternity of Jewish fathers. In this case, paternity testing, different from Cuba, different from the New York Times article, but once again, we can see how race comes into, and questions about race mixing come into discussions of and practices of paternity testing. In this case, paternity testing and racial testing are in some ways inseparable. They become really inseparable in the late 1930s in Germany. The racialization of paternity science is also evident in the migration of this science from family law to immigration law. In the 1950s, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service began requiring paternity tests of prospective immigrants from China. And these prospective immigrants claimed to be the sons of naturalized Chinese-American fathers, but the INS believed that they were fraudulent claims and that a paternity test would reveal these imposters. Again, blood testing's exclusionary possibilities are perfect for the purposes of the INS, because all they can allow you to do, of course, is exclude and identify cases where putative fathers and children are not compatible. So in this case, the paternity test was supposed to prove kinship and thereby expose not only these false paper sons, but potentially the Chinese communists who might be seeking to infiltrate the United States under cover of this false kinship. So here we have paternity testing being used at the service of an anti-communist, clearly very racialized immigration policy. And to my knowledge, my research has suggested so far that this is actually the 1950s US, and the case of Chinese immigrants is actually the first use of genetic testing in immigration law in the world, as far as I know. And of course, those tests have now become, today with DNA, a routinely used in immigration procedures in receiving societies the world over, not just the United States, but all sorts of Europe, et cetera, Australia, and in cases in which immigrants seek to gain entry or citizenship based on their kinship status, right? So what we can draw from all of these examples, and again, I'm still trying to come up with a language for how to talk about the relationship between paternity and race. It's everywhere, but it's hard to articulate. What we can draw, though, from all of these examples is that paternity testing does something other than just test paternity. It performs what we might call the work of boundary making. It regulates the boundaries of the family, but in so doing, it also regulates those of the nation, quite literally, who is Jewish and who is German, who is black and who is white, who is a true Chinese American citizen, and who is a communist imposter. A final hypothesis, which takes us up to the present, and then I will stop. Global histories of family and childhood have emphasized cross-cultural convergence towards modern norms and values over the course of the 20th century. And yet the lens of paternity testing seems to me to reveal a very different narrative. It seems to reveal rather patterns of divergence and variation, rather than the world becoming more similar, which is really a hegemonic refrain of a lot of writing about family and childhood in the 20th century and the 21st century by historians, rather than becoming a story about all the world becomes the same. Paternity testing is really a story about how different parts of the world become different or look different. In particular, I'm struck by the starkly different ways that contemporary societies have responded to the possibilities and dilemmas of paternity science. Let me give 3 very brief examples, and then I'll stop. Take France today. French law today prohibits outright any paternity testing except that ordered by a court. You cannot have a paternity test done as a private individual out of personal curiosity, say, in France today. And people who would like to get around this law actually send tissue, their cheek swabs or what have you, through the mail to Swiss or Spanish labs, which is illegal, but they do it anyway. And the purpose of this ban of not allowing paternity testing except with a judge's order is to protect children's rights. This is the stated reason for the law. That it isn't fair to deprive children of fathers, of social fathers, emotional fathers, because they are shown to be non-biological fathers, or that they're not the child's biological father. So this is about children's rights and about family stability, privileging a social rather than a biological definition of paternity. That makes sense, except then we look at Latin America. In the name of protecting children's rights, actually the same rationale, Latin America today, many countries in Latin America, have adopted the exact opposite, you might say, policy. As I mentioned before, Latin America has a long history of non-marital unions of so-called illegitimate children, and also a long history of prohibiting paternity investigation. And so in this context, paternity testing, DNA paternity testing, has a very different meaning. In Latin America today, public education campaigns, such as this one in Costa Rica, but we could come up with other examples in Brazil, Bolivia, and other countries, urge people that in a democratic nation, all children have an inalienable right to a paternal identity. And so this brochure and many other public campaigns urge mothers, unmarried mothers, to come in for a paternity test paid by the state in order to identify the fathers of their children. So paternity testing is couched in this language of democratic citizenship and human rights. This, of course, in a post-authoritarian moment in Latin America when ideas about democratic citizenship are really hegemonic in political discussions. And so paternity testing is couched or framed in these same terms: human rights, democracy, citizenship. So in the name of children's rights, paternity testing is being promoted by the state as opposed to prohibited by the state, as in France. And finally, we come to the US, just to give 3 examples, and we could give many, many more. In the United States, state law is a morass of contradictions and contradictory mandates on the status of scientific paternity testing. In Kansas and New Jersey, in recent years, legislators have actually introduced bills calling for mandatory DNA testing for all children at birth. Seems unlikely that will pass, but it is interesting that that has been a proposal. And meanwhile, of course, here in the United States, you can buy a paternity test as a private individual in your local pharmacy for as little as $70. Or, of course, if you can't make it to the pharmacy, there is always your mobile paternity test trolling the streets of New York City and Boston. So what does all this tell us? Well, I think ultimately what it tells us is that a historical perspective on the evolution of paternity science can help us make sense of some of the contemporary ethical, legal, and social quandaries and the dizzying array of responses that societies have generated to resolve these quandaries surrounding this technology. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. So if you have any, I'll come around with the microphone.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I've got one question which relates to the example of the swapped children, because I was wondering whether there are countries or institutions which regularly test the mother's relation to the child as well as the father's. So if you question the paternity, is it automatically also checked whether the mother is the biological mother of the child, or does that remain unclear? Great because question. I remember from German television where you had all these TV shows where people would come in and have their kind of relationship checked and whether the child is actually the child of that father. The mother was always tested as well.
Interesting. Not that I can think of. I mean, today, obviously, hospitals have developed protocols that attempt to make sure that babies go home with the people that engendered them, and they do that by, fingerprinting and little bracelets and that kind of stuff. And actually, people taught those methods come about really in the 1920s and 30s when people in many places in Europe and the United States start having children in hospitals. But whether they actually use tests to link mothers and children, not that I know of. And again, the relationship between mothers and children is always understood to be somehow unproblematic, obvious, empirically verifiable. And if we think about this, it's actually a very it's not odd. I mean, it makes sense as an assumption, but it's a big assumption. The idea that the ephemeral moment of birth therefore marks a child's identity for the rest of its life, and that children are never separated from their mothers. That's a big assumption. And one of the sort of starting points of this project is to suggest that these taken for granted assumptions about maternal certainty and paternal uncertainty are just that, taken for granted assumptions, rather than truly obvious or irrefutable facts about Mother Nature. And it's striking to me how recurring they are, even in critical feminist scholarship on surrogacy and in vitro fertilization and all of these kinds of things. There's still this assumption that motherhood, what at least used to be certain, maybe it isn't now with all of these funky new technologies, but it used to be certain. Well, it was never certain. That's to me, that's a social construction that serves certain functions, just like the trope of paternal uncertainty. So one of the things I'd like to do is subtly take stabs at those assumptions. Yes.
I was wondering whether you have looked at the differences between societies in the way they treat the outcome of this paternal identification. And I'm asking that because in my research I've come across many testimonies of Turkish women that were part of Turkish families that later on discovered that they were Armenian women exchanged. So, and in a completely different context, we are talking about blood race again, and there were claims about blood memory, kind of dangerous ideas about race being connected with a sense of identity and memory. And I was wondering whether you've come across any of those notions in your research.
I mean, that's interesting. And these are cases that happen in the present, sort of contemporary?
Around the beginning of 20th century.
Oh, okay, interesting. These refrains about identity and whether identity is something that one carries in the blood, and the tensions between nature and nurture are certainly constant in these refrains, in these materials. And it seems to me that these different cases, I mean, I don't look at how people evolve over time, what was their experience later on, but it seems to me that these issues of identity are telescoped in these cases of, supposed baby swapping, et cetera. I can think of, sort of just thinking off the top of my head, some of the baby swapping cases. There were a series of them in the 1920s in the United States in various urban centers. And in one of the cases, the young woman at age 18 decides that she's been placed with the wrong family, that, after this huge scientific investigation, it was determined that she should stay with the family that brought her home from the hospital, even though there were serious doubts as to whether she was really their daughter. And at age about 18, she goes to live with the other family, convinced that she's been placed with the wrong family and that she always felt, So there are most definitely those kinds of sentiments expressed.
Yes, thanks again for this fascinating talk. I'm curious what brought you to this. I mean, what piqued your interest and began the trajectory of the academic research?
That's a great question. It was the teeth. I was working on another project in Latin American family history and looking through family law treatises, and I kept coming across these very odd 1930s medico-legal treatises about teeth and blood and faces. And I thought, my first question was, well, that's odd. Did they work? And the second question was, well, when did paternity testing come around? So I switched over to Google and said, well, what's the history? Where's the book about the history of paternity testing? And I discovered there wasn't one. But it was really a sense of unrecognition of reading those medical legal treatises from Latin America. And then I realized, oh, this isn't just a Latin American phenomenon, it's actually a global one. I mean, one of the reasons that those treatises struck me as so odd was because I just finished a book that was all about social and legal constructions of family in the 19th century. So I thought, well, this must be what's going on in the 20th century. And in some ways, that's exactly what this project is, the 20th century continuation, not just about Chile, but about the world, of issues that I was interested in my first book in the 19th century. But it was those strange treatises about teeth that first did it for me. There was just a sense of unrecognition of, did people really believe this, and did they really work, and when did tests really work? And then my questions moved on a little bit from that, from trying to determine the real paternity test versus the fake ones. But it seemed to me there was something important going on in those materials about how people were imagining descent and identity in ways that looked both familiar and very strange to me, coming from, the beginning of the 21st century.
We have time for one more, if there's one. Yep.
Yes.
Hold on 1 second. You can go ahead if you want.
Scientific knowledge and legal practice sometimes don't get along very well. And I was wondering if there's any interesting things you can say about how the legal system accepted different versions of scientific knowledge over time.
That's a great question. One of the very few histories that's been written about any of this was a dissertation maybe 20 years ago about blood testing in U.S. courts and the reception of scientific knowledge in courtrooms. And the thesis writer concluded that, the backstory of this is that blood testing in the U.S. had real trouble establishing itself in courts. There was a lot of rejection of paternity blood testing in the 1930s and even into the 1940s. And probably the best example of this is the famous Charlie Chaplin case, in which Charlie Chaplin was sued by his young paramour, whose name I'm blanking on, who claimed he was the father of her child. A blood test showed that Charlie Chaplin could not possibly was incompatible with the alleged child, and yet the jury found him guilty of being the father's child and condemned him to paying child support for the rest of her life, I think. So this is in the early 1940s. Scientists are appalled by this outcome. The courts of California today have declared white is black and black is white, and up is down, et cetera. So that case is often taken as emblematic of the court's suspicion of scientific practice. But I would suggest that what's going on in that case and many others is not so much a rejection of scientific practice or a suspicion about scientific method. It's rather a desire to assert an alternative definition of paternity. So Charlie Chaplin is the father of that child because he is a notorious cad, a notorious womanizer, an older man who famously runs around after very young women, a foreigner and a communist to boot. And this is the way that the jury will discipline this man by condemning him as the father of this child. That is what paternity is. Paternity is taking responsibility for the young woman, for the child of the young woman you have seduced, regardless of whether you are the actual biological father of that child. So that's a case where you can really see the tensions between different definitions of paternity. So there's an example of where I think courts are suspicious, or in this case, the jury, it rejects the scientific evidence, not because it doesn't understand it or doesn't believe it, but because it has it's working with a different definition of paternity. Okay, thank you. Go drink your green beer.
Join me again in thanking Nara Milanich. We are back here again on Thursday for the first of our three Bloomberg Dialogues on Astrobiology. This is part of our NASA Library of Congress Astrobiology program. We'll be having 7 participants, 7 scholars on stage discussing the intersection of astrobiology and religion. The title of the program is Astrobiology and the Religious Imagination. So that's 3:30 p.m. here in this room on Thursday. Please sign our list on the way out to learn more. And I invite all of you to join us in the back for some light refreshments. Thanks again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.